My daughter-in-law spent years turning my son against me. Eventually, they cut me out of their lives completely. For 18 years, I never got a call, a visit, or even a birthday card. Then my woodworking business took off, and I bought a 40-acre farm. The very next day, they showed up at my gate smiling. "Dad, we're moving in," my son said. "You've got plenty of room." I listened quietly, nodded, and did one thing that neither of them saw coming. I want to start with my son's mother, because you cannot understand the shape of what happened without understanding what we lost first. She was the kind of woman who could make a stranger feel like family inside of 5 minutes. Not because she worked at it, but because it was simply the way she was built, something warm and easy that radiated off her without effort. She could not have been more different from me in that regard. I have always been slow to open up, careful with my words, more comfortable with a piece of wood in my hands than with people in a room. She was the one who made our home feel like a place people wanted to be. She was the one who made our son the kind of boy he became. She got sick when our son was 17. By the time he graduated from college, she was gone. I raised him the last 2 years of high school alone, working double shifts at the lumberyard, keeping the lights on, keeping his college fund intact the way she would have wanted. He graduated on time, got a scholarship, got a good job in finance in Nashville. I watched him walk across that stage and thought she would have loved to see this. That thought has never left me entirely. He met his wife when he was 26. She was smart and well put together and had a way of assessing a situation that I noticed immediately. Even at that first dinner, he had reserved a table at a nice restaurant in Nashville. Not the kind I would have picked, but I understood he wanted to make a good impression on my behalf, and I appreciated it. She was already seated when I arrived, and she stood to greet me with a smile that was warm enough to feel real, but careful enough that I knew I was being evaluated. I shook her hand and said it was nice to meet her and meant it. She said the same thing, and I believe she meant it too, but for different reasons than mine. He was happy. That was the most important thing. He was the happiest I had seen him since before his mother got sick, and I was not going to put a shadow on that, so I said nothing about the small things I had noticed. The way her eyes moved around the room when I spoke. The way she angled herself toward him during the meal in a way that subtly excluded me from the conversation without appearing to. The way she described my house later that fall when they came down for Thanksgiving as cozy. Just that word, cozy, delivered with a small smile that could have meant anything. I let it go. I was good at letting things go by then. The first Christmas after the wedding was mostly fine. She had strong opinions about how holidays were supposed to be structured, what constituted a proper gathering, which traditions mattered and which were simply habits. Most of what she considered habits were things my wife had built, and I wasn't willing to call them that, but I kept my mouth shut. My son helped in the kitchen and seemed to enjoy himself and called me twice during January to follow up. Things were fine. I told myself things were fine. By the second year of their marriage, the calls were less frequent. Not dramatically so. Nothing you could point to and say there is the change, but looking back, the slope is clear from that point forward. We had spoken every Sunday for years, then every other Sunday, then once a month. Then I would call and he would pick up, but he sounded elsewhere, distracted, like someone who was in one room while trying to be in another. I asked him once if everything was all right, and he said of course everything was fine. He missed my birthday in year 3. He called 2 days later and apologized and said they had been traveling and lost track of time. I said that was completely fine, because I was the kind of man who said things were fine when they were not, and I did not want to make him feel guilty over a phone call. What I wanted was to hear his voice. What I said was, "I know you're busy." He missed my birthday again the following year. This time the call came a week later, and something about the quality of it was different, careful, like he was reading from a script he had rehearsed in advance. He asked how I was doing, and I said fine, and he said good, and we talked about nothing for 10 minutes and hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand for a while after that, not because I thought something was seriously wrong yet, but because the version of my son who had once called me from his dorm room at 11 at night just to talk about a baseball game was becoming harder and harder to hear in these conversations. By year 4, the calls were coming once every few months, initiated almost always by me, and there was a pattern to them that I began to recognize. He was friendly. He answered questions. He did not ask many of his own. He never mentioned his wife during these calls. He said things like, "We've been busy and things are good and we should get together soon," and none of those things ever led anywhere concrete. I would suggest coming up to Nashville, and he would say that sounded great, and then nothing would be scheduled. Eventually, I stopped suggesting it. The year my son turned 32, his wife called me herself. She had never called me directly before. She asked if I had a few minutes, and I said I did, and she spoke for the next 15 minutes in a measured, calm tone that I recognized as the tone of a person who had rehearsed what they were going to say and was determined not to deviate from it. She told me that she and my son had been doing a lot of reflection about the relationships in their lives. She told me they had been working with a therapist. She told me that my son had struggled in certain ways with some patterns from his childhood, and that those patterns had made certain relationships difficult for him to maintain in a healthy way. She did not use my name during any of this. She said they were committed to protecting their household and their peace. She said she hoped I would understand. She said they needed space. I asked to speak with my son. She said he was unavailable at the moment, but that he agreed with everything she had said and that she was speaking on his behalf. I thanked her for the call. I set the phone down on the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. Outside, it was December. The light had gone out of the sky early the way it does in December. The house was very quiet. I want to be precise twice about what I felt in that moment because I have had a long time to think about it. It was not rage. Rage is a fire, and this was not a fire. It was something slower and heavier. It was grief of a particular kind, the kind that comes when you realize a thing you had hoped might still be salvageable is in fact already gone. Like finding out someone you loved has been gone for months and no one told you. The arrangements had already been made. The decisions had already been settled. I just hadn't been informed until now. I made dinner. I ate it alone. I washed the dishes. I went to bed. The next morning, I got up before dawn, the way I always have, and I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table in the dark and thought about what kind of man I was going to be for the next chapter of my life. There is a version of that morning where I get in my truck and drive to Nashville and knock on their door. I thought about that version. I decided against it because it would have changed nothing and cost me something I couldn't afford to lose, which was my own self-respect. My father did not raise a man who chases after people who have decided they don't want him. He raised a man who figures out what he has and works with it. What I had was a house, a truck, a job at the lumber yard I had held for 19 years, and a side business I had been running on weekends for the last 4. The side business was custom woodworking. Rocking chairs primarily, early on, then dining tables, then cabinets and built-in shelving. Word-of-mouth referrals from neighbors had grown it into something modest but real, and I had kept it small because my son had been in my life, and my time had been divided accordingly. That was no longer the case. That same morning, before I left for work, I sat down at my desk and did 2 things. The first was open a private savings account with the money I had set aside from the woodworking side business. The second was write out a card. I did not know entirely what I was doing when I started it, but I addressed an envelope to my son's house in Nashville, put a stamp on it, and wrote "Happy Birthday" on the inside of a card I had bought 6 months earlier and never sent. His birthday was in March. It was December. I sealed it and set it on the counter to mail on my way to work the next morning. I don't entirely know why I did that. I think part of it was stubbornness. Part of it was something quieter and harder to name. Something that said, if you stop acknowledging him entirely, you lose him in a way that goes beyond the distance that already exists. So I kept acknowledging him. Not because I expected a response, because it was the kind of man I was trying to be. That spring, I hired my first assistant. A young man I knew from my church who was good with his hands and needed steady work. I paid him fairly and trained him slowly, and within a year he was competent enough that I could take on twice the commissions I had been handling alone. I rented workshop space on the edge of town, then bought it when the owner offered to sell. I took out a business loan for the first time in my life, and it kept me awake for several nights, but I paid it off ahead of schedule. I left the lumberyard the following year. My supervisor, a good man I had worked alongside for 2 decades, shook my hand on my last day and told me I was making a mistake. I told him I hoped so. That is the closest thing to a joke I am capable of making, and he laughed at it, which I appreciated. Every year after that, I sent the cards. His birthday in March, always 2 weeks early the way I had been taught by my mother, who believed a card that arrived on time had been sent too late. Father's Day in June, Christmas in December. I did not write long messages inside them. A line or two, sometimes just my name. I understood that these were not really communications in any conventional sense. They were something else. A record, a way of marking time, a refusal to let the relationship end entirely on someone else's terms. The first 2 years I had no way of knowing whether the cards were arriving. Then in the 3rd year, I started getting them back. Stamped return to sender in the red ink of the postal service, my own handwriting on the front of the envelope, the corner of the stamp slightly bent from the journey. The first time it happened, I stood at my mailbox for a long time. Then I went inside and put the card in a box I kept in my office. The next one came back too, and the one after that. I kept every single one in the same box in order, the way a person keeps records of something they are not sure how to categorize but know they cannot discard. By year 10, there was a substantial stack. By year 15, the box was nearly full. I sometimes took it out and looked at the envelopes without opening them. I thought about opening them. I never did. The seals were the point somehow. The fact that they had never been read was part of what they were. I don't know when his wife had the address changed or the mail rerouted, or whether they had moved and simply not informed me, or whether something more deliberate had been put in place. I did not investigate it. The cards came back and I put them in the box, and that was the arrangement. The business grew in the way that things grow when you stop thinking about them as symbols of something and start thinking about them as simply the work. By year 6, I had 3 employees. By year 8, I had a contract with an interior design firm in Nashville, which was either ironic or appropriate depending on how you looked at it. By year 10, I had a regional reputation and a waiting list for custom commissions. The pieces I was making by that point were not the kind of thing I had ever imagined when I started. Custom hardwood dining tables 8 feet long, hand-planed and finished with linseed oil and beeswax, the kind of surfaces that develop character over years of use. Built-in library shelving that took 6 weeks to complete and became the architectural center of a room. Rocking chairs shaped to a specific person's measurements and weight distribution, each one a year of learning everything I had gotten wrong in the one before. I was featured in a regional magazine in year 11. A small piece, 2 pages, but it brought a wave of inquiries that kept the shop busy for the better part of a year. I hired a 4th employee. I moved to a larger workshop space on the other side of town. I bought a truck that was not falling apart, which was the first time in 15 years I had been able to say that. My business partner came into into the operation in year 12. He had been a friend for longer, the kind of friend who tells you the truth even when it costs him something. And when he asked if he could buy in, I agreed because I trusted his judgment and because the business had grown to a size where I needed someone who understood numbers the way I understood wood. He handled the business side, the contracts and projections and the conversations with design firms. I handled the craft. It was the most sensible arrangement I had ever been part of. In year 15, I found the property. He had been telling me for 2 years that I should consider buying land, that the farmhouse I was renting on the edge of town was a waste of money compared to what I could own outright, that the business was generating enough to make it the reasonable thing to do. He was right, and I knew he was right. And the reason I waited 2 years is that buying land in Tennessee felt like an admission that I was not going back. Not that there was anything to go back to, but a man can know a thing is over and still not be ready to put a monument to it. The 40 acres were listed for 12 days before I made an offer. A farmhouse, a barn that needed more work than the listing suggested, a separate outbuilding that would become my workshop, and a property line that followed the river for a quarter-mile along the back. I walked the land on a Tuesday afternoon in October, the light coming in at the angle it gets in Tennessee in fall, everything orange and gold, the river moving steadily behind the tree line, and I thought, yes, this is where I am going to finish becoming whoever I am going to be. The restoration took 2 years. I did most of it myself on evenings and weekends while the business continued. The farmhouse had good bones, the kind of structure built to last when people still believed in building things to last, and most of what it needed was patience and attention and the willingness to do the work slowly. I replaced the porch boards myself, each one. I rebuilt the kitchen from the studs. The floors I sanded by hand because I did not trust a machine to know what the wood needed. I remortared the stone fireplace in the front room during a week in February, when the temperature outside dropped into the single digits, and I worked in a coat and gloves and got more mortar on myself than on the stone. By the time I moved in, the farmhouse smelled like sawdust and linseed oil, and the particular cold weather smell of stone that has been worked on and is warming up again, which is about the best a house can smell. The morning I finished the last of the paperwork and had it in hand, my business partner drove out and we sat on the back porch and drank coffee and watched the river. He was quiet for a long time, the way a man is quiet when he is taking in something worth taking in, and then he said, "You built this." I said most of it was here already. He said that was not what he meant. I was 63 years old. I had not spoken to my son in 18 years. I had mailed him 72 birthday cards, 18 Father's Day cards, and 18 Christmas cards, none of which had ever been acknowledged. I had a business worth more than I had ever expected a man like me to have, a property that was entirely mine, and a quiet that had a different quality from the quiet of those early years. That earlier quiet had been the quiet of loss, of the particular grief that comes from being cut out of someone's life without recourse. This quiet was something else. It had been earned. It had been constructed, one morning at a time, over 18 years of getting up before dawn and working. I want to be honest about something. I was not happy in any simple sense. I don't think I was built for happiness in any simple sense. What I had was better than happiness, in the way that a well-made piece of furniture is better than a decorative one. Solid, purposeful, built to endure. When I sat on that back porch in the mornings with my coffee and listened to the river, I was not thinking about what I had lost. I was thinking about the day's work, about the commission in progress, about the season, about the way the light moved across the property at different times of year. That is as close to peace as I know how to get, and it is enough. The call came on a Tuesday morning in late September. I was in the workshop when my phone rang, a number I did not recognize. I almost let it go. There are a lot of calls I let go, but something made me set down the plane and answer. Dad. It was his voice. Older, the way voices get older over 18 years, but unmistakably his. I had not heard it in all that time, and I want to tell you it hit me like a physical thing, because it did. Something in the chest, in the very specific place where grief and hope live next to each other, which is a dangerous neighborhood. I said his name. There was a pause. Then he said, "I know it has been a long time." I could hear in his voice that this was prepared, or at least rehearsed, and I filed that away without reacting to it. He said things had changed, that he and his wife had been going through a difficult period. He was vague about the nature of the difficulty in a way that was itself informative, because the kind of vagueness a person uses when discussing their difficulties tells you a great deal about the origin of those difficulties. He said they had been reassessing things. He said he had been thinking a lot about family. He said he was sorry for the distance, and he used the word distance the way certain people use it, as though it were a geographic phenomenon that had simply occurred rather than a thing that had been chosen and maintained. He mentioned the property. He had heard, through someone we both knew, that I had done well with the woodworking, that I had a place in Tennessee now, that it sounded beautiful. He asked how many acres. He asked about the farmhouse, the layout, the rooms. He asked, in what I recognized immediately as a careful and conversational framing, whether I had room for guests when they came. I said it was a nice place. He said he and his wife had been thinking about a fresh start somewhere quieter. He said he had always loved Tennessee. He said he missed family, and he used the word family in the way people use it when they primarily mean themselves. I told him I would need to think about it. What I did not tell him was that the moment I hung up the phone, I set it on my workbench and stood still for about 10 minutes. Then I went inside, sat at my desk, and called my attorney. He had handled my business contracts for 6 years, and I trusted his judgment above most most people's. I told him about the call. I told him what I suspected about the nature of the difficult period. I asked him to find out what he could. He asked me what I wanted to do in the meantime. I said I wanted to keep the conversation open just long enough to learn what I needed to learn. Then I called my business partner. I told him about the call the way I had told him most things over the years, which was plainly and without editorializing. He was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then he said, "Do you want to see them?" I thought about it, honestly. I said I wanted to see my son. He said that was not exactly what I had said. He was right. The next 3 weeks were, in practical terms, a research project. My attorney is thorough and has access to resources that most people do not know exist, and within 10 days, he had assembled a picture that was considerably clearer than anything my son had communicated on the call. They had been involved in a financial venture that had gone wrong, not wrong in the way things go wrong through bad luck or poor judgment, but wrong in the way things go wrong when there is a pattern of decisions that do not hold up well to scrutiny. Other people had been affected. There were legal proceedings that were ongoing and unresolved. The direction of those proceedings was not favorable. They had been staying with friends for several months. The lease on the Nashville property had ended. The vehicle my son was currently driving was leased, and the payments were several months past due. His wife had closed her social media accounts. She had always had active social media accounts. I read through the file my attorney had prepared, and then I set it on the desk and looked out the window at the workshop for a while. None of what was in the file surprised me exactly, but seeing it laid out with specificity, with dates and figures attached, clarified something that had been sitting at the edges of my thinking since the first call. This was not a reconciliation. This was a resource assessment. They had heard I was doing well, had learned about the property, and had run some version of the arithmetic that his wife had been running since the first time she sat at my table and called my house cozy. The arithmetic had come up different now, and so the decision had come up different. I called my attorney back and told him I wanted to proceed with the property trust. We had discussed the concept before, and he had recommended it for estate planning purposes regardless of the current situation. But I wanted it done specifically, and I wanted it done before they arrived. He said he could have the paperwork ready within the week. I said that would be fine. I also, during those 3 weeks, had 2 more calls with my son. He had called back the week after the first call, and the conversations had a quality to them that I recognized. Warm, cautiously personal, designed to establish a rapport that would make the eventual ask feel natural. He talked about missing Tennessee, about the work I had built, about the farmhouse. He asked whether I had considered having family nearby as I got older. He was good at it, or she was, and I let the conversations go where they needed to go and said things like that is possible and I would have to think about it. On the 3rd call, his wife got on the line. Her voice was different than I remembered, or perhaps it was the same voice deployed differently, softer, more reflective. She said she had done a great deal of thinking about the past. She said she was not proud of some of the decisions she had made. She said she hoped there was a path forward for all of them. She used the word family 4 times in 2 sentences, which is a frequency that tells you something. I said I was open to a conversation in person. I gave them a date. They arrived on a Saturday in October, the best time of year for this part of Tennessee, when the air has finally come down from the brutal heat of summer and the trees along the river have begun to turn, and everything you look at seems to be lit from inside. I had made coffee and left it on the stove and had been up since before dawn, which is my habit regardless of circumstance. I was on the back porch when I heard the car come up the gravel drive. I stayed where I was until they had gotten out and come around to the front of the house before I went down to meet them. I wanted those few seconds. I wanted to see them before they saw me. His wife came out of the car first. She was well dressed as she had always been, a blazer and dark slacks that were not overdone for the country, but had been chosen with care, and she moved the way she had always moved, with a kind of deliberate composure. She stood beside the car and looked at the property, and I watched her eyes go from the farmhouse to the workshop building to the tree line and back. I had seen that look in rooms and offices for 40 years, the look of a person calculating the gap between what something is worth and what it might be obtainable for. It is not a subtle look if you know what you are watching for. My son came around from the passenger side. He was 50 now, with gray beginning to work through his hair at the temples, and he looked like himself but heavier, not in weight so much as in some quality of bearing, the way certain kinds of sustained pressure accumulate on a person over time. He saw me coming down from the porch and his face changed in a way that was hard to read, not quite relief, not quite guilt. Something between those two things, something that had the texture of a person arriving somewhere they know they have complicated feelings about, but have not yet sorted through. He shook my hand when I reached them. The handshake lasted half a second longer than a handshake between two people with uncomplicated histories would last, which is the kind of thing you notice when you have been watching people for 63 years. His wife stepped forward and took my hand in both of hers and said it was so good to be here, and she said it with an emphasis on here that I recognized immediately, because here was precisely what she had come for. I showed them the property. I did not rush it. I showed them the farmhouse first, room by room, pointing out the work I had done, the rebuilt kitchen, the refinished floors, the porch I had replaced board by board. I showed them the second bedroom, which I had furnished simply, and the third bedroom, which I was using as an office. His wife asked about the third bedroom twice in different ways, once to clarify the square footage, and once to ask whether I had considered what I might do with the space as my needs changed over time. I said I was happy with how I was using it. I showed them the workshop. This was the part that seemed to affect my son most genuinely. He walked the length of the space and ran his hand along the surface of a commission in progress, a long cherry dining table for a client in Knoxville, and he looked at the tools on the walls and the stacks of lumber organized by species along the far wall, and something crossed his face that was real, that was not performed. I think he was proud of me in that moment. I noted it without allowing it to change my resolve. His wife asked about the workshop's potential, framed as admiration. She asked whether I had ever considered the property as a venue, a hospitality opportunity. She used the word opportunity the way certain people use it, as a container you can pour anything into, and it still sounds like a compliment. We went back inside for coffee. The first evening was pleasant in the surface way that evenings are pleasant when everyone present is being careful. She had brought wine, a bottle of something that was not cheap, and she opened it and poured it without asking, which told me something about the way she saw her position in the room. My son and I sat at the kitchen table and talked about things I had made, about commissions I had completed, about the timber suppliers I used, and the species that were becoming harder to source. He asked good questions. He had always been smart and curious, and those qualities were still present underneath whatever else had accumulated on top of them. She moved around the kitchen in a way that was deliberate without being obvious. She examined things, the finishes on the cabinets, the grain of the countertop, the view from the window over the sink. She made comments that were complimentary in ways that contained measurements inside them. What a perfect amount of space. The layout is so efficient. You have really made the most of what is here. After dinner, I built a fire because the evenings had gotten cold and we sat in the front room. She began to talk. It started with how much she had missed Tennessee, which I did not engage with beyond a nod because she had spent their entire marriage in Nashville and had not, to my knowledge, spoken about Tennessee with any particular fondness during that time. Then she moved to the pace of their life lately, how exhausted they both were, how much they had been craving something quieter and simpler. Then she talked about family, about the importance of being connected, about the things that matter when you reach a certain stage of life. My son said less during this part of the evening than she did. He refilled my glass once without being asked, which was a small gesture, but a real one. He said at one point that he had missed this, just sitting and talking. I did not ask him why he had chosen to go 18 years without doing it. I filed the question away. She was building towards something and I let her build. By the time she got there, it was nearly 10 in the evening and the fire had burned down, and she said, "We have been thinking a lot about what a fresh start might look like. Somewhere rooted, somewhere that feels like home." She looked around the room without looking at me. My son said, "It would mean a lot to have family close, Dad." He said it quietly, the way a person says something they have been instructed to say and still means part of it. I said it was a lot to think about. I said we should get some rest and talk more in the morning. I showed them to the guest room, said goodnight, and closed my bedroom door. I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark for a few minutes, and I turned on the lamp and read until midnight, which is what I do when I need to keep my mind from running ahead of itself. I was up at 5 the way I always am, before the light, before the birds. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the silence of the house around me, and went through what was going to happen, which was the same thing I had decided 3 weeks ago when my attorney first laid out what he had found. The specifics had not changed. The plan had not changed. The only thing that had changed was that my son was sleeping 20 feet down the hall, and that proximity was doing something to the mathematics of the thing that I did not particularly want to examine too closely. I want to be honest about this. In the days before their arrival, I had told myself the plan was straightforward. I had documentation, I had the trust, I had clarity, and the clarity would carry the conversation. What I had not accounted for sufficiently was the specific weight of seeing my son in person after 18 years, of watching him walk along the workbench and run his hand across a piece of cherry and look like someone who was genuinely glad to be there, of hearing him say it would mean a lot to have family close, the part of it that was performed and the part that was not. But I had also not forgotten the Tuesday call, the careful, rehearsed quality of his voice when he asked how many acres the property was. I had not forgotten the way his wife moved around my kitchen taking inventory. I had not forgotten what my attorney had found and the particular nature of what it meant. I went to my office at 5:30 while the house was still quiet. Under the desk, where it had been for 18 years, was the banker's box. I had moved it twice over the years, once when I sold the old workshop space, and once when I moved from the rental into the farmhouse, but I had never opened it. I had never thrown it away. It had simply traveled with me, sealed, in the way that certain things travel with a person without ever being unpacked. I lifted the lid. The cards were stacked in order. 3 stacks. Birthdays, Father's Day, Christmas, each held together with rubber bands that had dried and stiffened over the years but not broken. The envelopes were all in my handwriting. The address was the last one I had for them in Nashville, the one that had been active for the first 2 years and then stopped receiving mail. The return address was whatever address I had been living at when I sent each one. I picked up the first stack and looked at the top envelope. The stamp had that particular slightly bent quality of something that has traveled a long way and come back. I had bought those stamps at a post office in Kentucky back when I was still at the lumber yard. I had written that card at my kitchen table on a December evening and addressed it and put it in my coat pocket to mail the next morning. I had dropped it in the box outside the post office on my way in to work in the dark. 3 weeks later, it had come back to me. I looked at the stacks for a long time. 72 birthday cards. 18 18 Father's Day cards, which was a particular kind of absurdity I had never allowed myself to dwell on for very long. The image of a man mailing Father's Day cards to the son who had cut him off and receiving them back and keeping them, filing them with the rest. 18 Christmas cards, sent each year in the first week of December, which is what my mother had always done, and what I saw no reason to change simply because the circumstances had. 108 envelopes, 108 gestures that had gone nowhere and been returned and kept, and underneath them, the account statement I had printed the night before and placed at the bottom of the box. I had opened the savings account the same morning I had made the decision to start working in earnest, 18 years ago. The initial deposit had been modest. The monthly contributions were not large, not by any standard of wealth, but they were consistent. What I had deposited each month was roughly what I estimated I would have spent on my son in a normal year of fatherhood, divided by 12. Birthday dinner, Christmas gift, groceries during a weekend visit, the small, unmemorable expenditures that constitute the ongoing financial texture of a relationship between a parent and an adult child who is still present in that parent's life. 18 years of those monthly deposits, never touched, compounded at the modest rate of a standard savings account, had accumulated to a figure that was printed on the last page of the statement. The figure was not dramatic by the standards of people who have dramatic figures, but it was real and specific, and it had a date attached to it going back 18 years. And when a person looked at that opening date and understood what it meant, that I had opened this account the same month I had been asked to leave their lives and had deposited into it every single month without interruption for 18 years since, the figure meant something considerably different than what it was in absolute terms. I gathered the stacks and the statement. I placed everything back in the box in the order it belonged. I closed the lid. I set the box on the corner of my desk and went to make the next pot of coffee. They came downstairs around 8:30, his wife first, already dressed and composed. My son came down a few minutes later, looking like someone who had not slept as well as he had hoped. I had made eggs and set them on the table with toast and coffee and orange juice, and the morning had a quality of false normalcy about it that I think all three of us recognized and were willing to maintain for the time being. The conversation over breakfast stayed on the surface. He asked about the commission in progress in the workshop. I told him about it, about the client, about the species of wood and the timeline. He asked about the business generally, about how I found new clients, about what a typical week looked like. I answered in general terms. His wife asked if I managed the acreage myself or had help. I said I managed it. She asked if I had given thought to the property's potential beyond its current use. I said I was satisfied with its current use. By 9:30, the breakfast things were cleared and we were sitting with the last of the coffee, and the conversation shifted in the way I had been waiting for it to shift. He began it this time, not her, which I noted. He said he wanted to be honest with me. He said he had not been as forthcoming as he should have been on the phone, that things were more difficult than he had let on. He said they had been through a challenging period and needed a real chance to reset, a real base, something stable. He said I had that and they did not, and he was asking for help. Then he said, I have been a terrible son to you. He said it plainly and without decoration, looking at me, and I believe he meant it. His wife was looking at the table during this part. I sat with that for a moment. I let it be what it was. Then I said, let me get something. I went to my office. I took the banker's box from the corner of the desk and carried it to the kitchen table and set it down between us. I told them they were welcome to stay as long as they needed, but I needed them to read through that first. My son looked at the box. He reached out and lifted the lid and looked at the contents. He picked up the top envelope from the birthday stack, turned it over, and looked at the return address for a long time. It was an address in Kentucky he recognized, the house he had grown up in. He opened the envelope. He took out the card. He read what I had written inside, which was, Happy birthday, son. I love you, your father. He set it on the table and picked up the next one. His wife had gone still in a way I had not seen her go still before. She was watching him open the cards, and her expression had changed from the composed pleasantness of breakfast into something less managed. He went through the birthday stack slowly. Some cards he read fully. Some he just looked at the handwriting on the outside of the envelope and set down without opening them. By the time he reached the Father's Day stack, he had stopped glancing at his wife. He was looking at the cards. She reached past him and picked up the statement from the bottom of the box. She turned to the last page. She found the total at the bottom. I watched her look at it. I watched her absorb what the date range on the account meant, what the opening date specifically meant. She put the statement down on the table in front of her and looked out the window at the property. She did not look at me. I gave them time. The number on the statement was not a small number. Not by the standards of 3 people sitting in a farmhouse in rural Tennessee on a Saturday morning in October. 18 years of monthly deposits, consistent and uninterrupted, into an account I had opened the same month they had told me I was a negative presence and asked me to leave their lives, compounded without interruption. The figure had a clarity to it that I did not need to explain. My son set down the card he had been holding. He did not look up immediately. I told them there was one more thing. I said the farm had gone into a trust that morning, that I had signed the paperwork before they arrived. The trust was structured so that no family member could inherit, claim, or access the property or any of its associated value unless I chose to amend the arrangement, and I had no plans to amend it. The business operated under a separate legal structure with its own succession plan, similarly protected. I said this not to punish punish anyone. I said it because they had arrived with a plan, and the plan was based on a set of assumptions about what I was and what I had built and what could be obtained from it, and I wanted those assumptions corrected clearly and in person. His wife said something then. She said it quietly and with a roughness in her voice that I had not heard before, something underneath the composure that had finally found the surface. She said they had a right to family. She said the past was complicated and everyone made mistakes, and this was not how families were supposed to operate. I told her that this was the farm I had built while my son's birthday cards came back to me, stamped return to sender for 18 years. I told her I was sorry they were in a difficult situation and that I hoped things improved for them. I told them they were welcome to finish their coffee. My son had not said anything in several minutes. He was sitting with one of the Christmas cards in his hand, turning it over slowly, looking at it the way a person looks at something they do not know how to hold. Then he looked up at me. For the first time in 18 years, he had absolutely nothing to say.